Well, good afternoon, everyone. Kind of feels like summer's actually here. Okay, in my sermonette today, we're going to be, the title of that sermonette is Joseph, son of Jacob, and we're going to be studying that a little bit because we can learn some things there, I think, that would be helpful to us, and it can, as it says in 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good deed. Okay, we're going to be going through some of the episodes of Joseph's life here, and they're going to be starting we'll be in Genesis for the whole sermonette here. There are some things hopefully we can learn from some of the things that happened there. You know, if you're familiar with the story, Joseph was a favorite son of Jacob, and he was used by God for some certain things. And if we start in Genesis chapter 37, in verse 3, we'll just kind of get an idea of what's going on here. Now Israel, or Jacob there, loved Joseph more than any of the other children because he was a son of his old age. And he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than his other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So Joseph was kind of out there. His brothers didn't think too much of him. So then in the next verse on top of that, things began to happen. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood up, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." He said this to his brothers, and they were not impressed at all, I can tell you that, and they were kind of displeased with him. And then it wasn't very much longer that in the 9th verse of that same chapter, he had another dream. He told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when we told this to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of a dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed, I and your mother and your brothers, bow down to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this matter in mind. In other words, his father thought, well, why is he having this dream? He thought there might be something to that. Anyway, in this story here, if you're not probably all familiar with it, but then Jacob had Joseph go out and check with his brothers. They were herding sheep, and he went out to check on them. Actually, Jacob sent Joseph out. And as it turns out, what had happened then is that his brothers had got together and decided they're going to make an end to this guy. They were going to kill him. And see, when he got out there, make a long story short, they decided they were going to kill him. But one of his brothers, Reuben, says, "No, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in this pit over there." So they threw him in the pit, and there he was. And then, if you look at they threw him in the pit, and then in verse 25 it says, this is of Genesis 37, "And they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming down the road, and their camels were carrying different things, resins and balms, and they were going their way down to Egypt. And Judah had an idea. He thought, well, we don't want blood in our hands, so let's sell him to these Ishmaelites here that are traveling through in this caravan. And so he did. They did. They sold it to him. And they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. So they didn't have to kill him, and they got some money out of it, so pretty good deal for them, I guess. Anyway, and then we go on in the story of Joseph here. And it ends up they went down to Egypt. Joseph was taken down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites. Now, so he went to work for Potiphar. And it says here, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that he was pretty capable and he was willing and had a good personality. And he saw that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in the sight of Potiphar. And he attended him, and he made him an overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, all that he had, the Lord blessed Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was in all that he had, and in the house and in the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him he had no concern of anything but the food that he ate. So here Joseph gets down there, and he finds himself in kind of a bad predicament, okay? Let's face it, Joseph was sold into slavery. He was a slave. They got some money for him, and then the Ishmaelites, they sold him like a cow or something. They just sold him, you know. And so he was actually a slave. But the first thing I think we need to learn from him is when he got down there, somewhere along the line, Joseph made the choice to have God's attitude about things. And his circumstances that he was in there, he had no choice over it. But he did the best he could. You know, he had a good attitude, and he worked hard. He kept God's attitude. He kept God's ideas as far as doing things, and he made a pretty good little place for himself there. And that's the first thing we need to recognize when you're in bad circumstances. And sometimes you find yourself in situations which are not ideal. We need to make a choice to do the best we can with what we have. And in doing that, making the best that we have of what we can, we need to keep in mind a godlike attitude. But just because we're a slave or in bad circumstances, we still need to keep going. We still need to do the best that we can. That's a godly way of looking at things. So, things are looking pretty good for Joseph here, at least work-wise. Okay, so here we go. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house. He has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife." So here we have the only thing that Joseph was kind of in charge of everything, but of course not Potiphar's wife. Now the next verse, the next sentence in this verse is kind of important, I think. And here's what he says. He says, "How could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He did not want to get involved in an adulterous situation. And it's interesting, if we think about today's world, in today's world for sure, his attitude is he did not want to sin against God. But now we have in a situation in the country now where, let's say Potiphar wasn't a very nice man and there were bad things going on. Would it have been different? If you are one of those people who changes your mind depending on the situation, it's called situational ethics, then it could be. We've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of that in the country lately. people who wouldn't do anything else, but the situations are bad, so they do bad things. As we might have seen on the news lately, lots of bad things are happening because they don't go by what God says. They're using their situational ethics, and they decide, well, if that's the case, we're just going to burn the place down or whatever. Situational ethics are really, really very, very bad, very unstable. You know, if you get an adulterous situation, there's lots of problems that come from that. You know, we have societal problems, we have marriage breakups, we have just all kinds of things that are the result of deciding, well, we'll do what we want to do. We're not necessarily going to follow God's law. And that goes not just for that sin, but many of the sins. The situational ethics say, well, if that's the way it's going to be, I'm going to do what I want to do. And boy, we see a lot of that in the country today. We just really do. But as Christians, we really need to look at what he did. And where he said he would not sin against God. David used that one time too. He said, I've sinned against God. That's the important thing, because God's law adds stability. It adds safety. It's a societal safety net, if you will, God's law. And when they decide to choose, when you choose, because of your own circumstances, not to obey that, there are significant problems that occur, not just with yourself, but all society is suffering from that. So that's my second point, is that we really need to be concerned about sinning against God's law. We need to be nice to people and stuff too, but that is secondary. We need to be watching out for God's laws, because in the end, God knows what he's doing. And situations get pretty messy sometimes, but regardless of what happens, we need to stick to God's law, because that's what will bring us out. That gives us safety and stability for the whole country, actually. Okay, let's go on to another little thing we can learn here from Joseph. Okay, well, as it turns out, Potiphar's wife was kind of spilled the beans and lied to the authorities about Joseph, and of course he ended up in jail again, or actually in a dungeon this time. Not a very good place to be. Okay, so let's go down to there. He gets into going to be in jail now here. Okay, let's go to Genesis 40. Genesis 40. And here it says that my headlines here are dreamers of two prisoners. Okay, so sometimes after this, the cupbearer and the king of Egypt, and the baker offended the Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in the custody of the house. Well, that was, he put them in jail. They were in jail, where Joseph was confined. So as time went on, they had, both the cupbearer and the baker had dreams. And so as Joseph was kind of into dreams, and they knew he had something to do with them, eventually they asked him if he could interpret their dreams. And he did. He did. And let's see if we can find it. If we go down in verse 12 of Genesis 40, then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. And then Joseph goes on, and he has a little request here. He says, but remember me when it is well with you. Please do not do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so to get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into jail, into dungeon. So he's asking the cupbearer, when he sees Pharaoh again, to put in a good word for him, mention to him that he shouldn't be locked up in this place. So as time goes on, then the baker gets his dream interpreted, which isn't so good. And so eventually The cupbearer is back in Pharaoh's good graces, and the baker is gone. So let's go into verse 23 of chapter 40. It says, yet the cupbearer, but the chief baker he hanged just as Joseph had interpreted it. And yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So here he is. He forgot him. And he forgot him for quite a while, too. As a matter of fact, he forgets him for 2 years. So for 2 years, Joseph is in that dungeon, and nothing happens. The cupbearer just forgets all about it, you know. So here's Joseph waiting away there. But if we go down to Genesis 41, verse 9, it says, now and in the meantime here, Pharaoh has had a couple dreams and are trying to find somebody to interpret those dreams. Verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. And then he goes on later on in verse 12 to say, a young Hebrew was with us and his servant, the captain of the guard, and we told him and he interpreted our dreams. So the other thing to remember here is that sometimes we have to wait. He waited 2 years. You know, times get tough. Sometimes we have to wait, and it doesn't always happen right away. And there he was, you know, but we need to wait. You know, one of the verses you find in the Bible often is the verse it should ring familiar to you, is he endures to the end, you know, but he who endures to the end, then he will be saved, you know. But during those 2 years, if you're waiting there, the only way to wait and really have confidence is not what you see. You have to have faith. Okay, so the third thing is Joseph had to have faith to keep going and keep doing what he needed to do. And you wait for the timing, you wait for the time for God's timing. And, you know, it's interesting. Then eventually, of course, we know the story, or most of us know the story, that Pharaoh, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and eventually he was made the second in command of Egypt, and he helped them store grain for their upcoming. They had a drought there that lasted 7 years, okay? And so they ran out of food. And, of course, it worked out pretty good because if he hadn't been there, then a lot of people would have starved, and Joseph's family back home, they would have starved too. So now these verses, these chapters in the Bible really are uplifting. We're living in times now that are not very good. I know sometimes I get pretty discouraged just watching the news and all the terrible things that are happening. But the Bible is full of interesting and inspiring messages. It's good for us to look back there. We need some uplifting messages sometimes. And we need to go back and examine some of these things. And like what been going over here with Joseph, I've only just scratched the surface just a little bit here, but there are lessons to be learned, and it'll give you a little bit of hope in life because we're in kind of a tough time, and we need some uplifting messages, and they're in the Bible. So we have to remember to read our Bibles, study them, and we can be uplifted by that. And we are in troubling times right now. We really are in this country, but it can give us some hope, and that's what they're there for, and they're there to help us. So I encourage you to find the lessons in the Bible and read them over and gather what you can from them.